Hi, my name is Bruce Fenton. I'm a researcher and author, and sometimes media personality. I've appeared in Ancient Aliens and also in the Unexplained Files and other streaming shows, both in the UK, US, and Russia over the years. But today I want to talk about a discovery I made some years ago, in fact, back in 2018. And as wild as this will sound, I discovered evidence highly suggestive of alien contact with this world and indeed an alien intervention in human evolutionary history. It's a big claim. Now, let me explain what happened. So, for a project I was working on at that time about human origins, which led to my book, The Forgotten Exodus, The Inter-Africa Theory of Human Evolution, through this project, I came into contact with a lady called Valerie Barrow. And she was based out in Australia, but she's passed on now. And more specifically, I came in contact with her book, which is called Alcheringa, When the First Ancestors Were Created. Now, this is a very unusual book, but it details her experiences after coming into possession of an artifact, an Aboriginal artifact called a Chiringa. Now, I won't go into all of the Aboriginal lore around the Chiringa, but in brief, the story of these things is that they were left here or created here by powerful beings that existed in the dreaming or the dream time, called the Alcheringa. And that these beings created these living receptacles of knowledge that were able to pass on messages and had a connection to human origins. There's a whole load of interesting lore around these. But the thing is, while Valerie was in possession of this Chiringa, she began to experience a kind of voice-to-skull communication, a voice that was telling her it was the Chiringa, that it was an entity called Alcheringa, and that it had information about human origins and about our prehistory. She ended up with quite a lot of information, but the brief of this is that it told her there'd been a visitation hundreds of thousands of years ago involving a vast megastructure, an AI silica megastructure that had arrived here from the Pleiades specifically, and that this had then been in orbit before being destroyed by another party that was also present here at that time. And this structure was reduced to melt, and that this molten material essentially rained down across the planet, is the description. Survivors from this craft then landed near to Broken Bay in New South Wales. They were struggling to survive. They were poorly equipped to remain here because they normally used genetic engineering technologies to change themselves to the environments of planets they were colonizing. Which makes a lot of sense because you think about it, none of us would be suited to alien worlds. So how do you colonize another world? Well, we know that NASA are already looking at this idea of genetically enhancing astronauts as well as technologically enhancing them. That it's very likely that any colonization of other planets, like Mars, for example, that we would consider using genetic engineering technologies to make astronauts more resilient to cosmic rays and gravity anomalies and all the rest of this, things that the human body is not evolved for. So with the destruction of their craft, apparently these beings were not able to finish the process of adapting themselves to this world. And so they were struggling to breathe. They were struggling with the radiation. They couldn't drink the water without getting bacterial issues. They had all these like tangible, real problems that you can imagine you would have, things you'd have to deal with if this happened to, an Earth mission to another planet. So they realized as well that they couldn't survive long term, and this original plan to colonize Earth was over. So what they came up with instead was Plan B, which was to modify the indigenous hominins that were here to make them more like themselves and pass on elements of their knowledge and culture to these modified beings. They also, well, apparently in the information that was given to Valerie, there also was a follow-up mission 5 years later And this was by another group of the same alliance of beings, except they were more like kind of enforcers or military wing. And so they made contact with the survivors, and they offered to help them, but they also made contact with the parties responsible for the destruction of this craft and warned them to leave this planet before they began a bombardment. But this was no ordinary bombardment. So what they used is redirected asteroids to pound underground facilities on planets, which is what the situation was here. And so although most of these other beings apparently fled the planet, some remained. And so a bombardment began. They redirected asteroids and they pounded the planet. Well, this stuff sounds so wild, science fiction, of course. But there was sufficient details in this information to allow me to actually investigate and see whether this was true. Because one of the things I did know was that this Alcheringa had all the hallmarks of being something called a Bracewell Sentinel probe. Now, just a background on that. Back in 1960, a scientist called Ronald Bracewell published a paper detailing his hypothesis that advanced alien civilizations in the Milky Way would, over time, contact each other. They would stumble on each other and form a kind of loose network of intelligent beings across the galaxy. And that expanding this network would almost certainly involve sending out probes, but not ordinary probes. So it made the most sense if these were in some way autonomous, intelligent, devices that could act as both explorers and emissaries to other worlds. So these were his sentinel probes, technologies that could sit on the surface of a planet or in orbit, recording events, and at the appropriate moment, making contact with any developing or developed civilization to then potentially bring them into this network of worlds. So this artifact, this Alcheringa, sounds awfully like one of these, an object that's been sitting here for hundreds of thousands of years, a small compact silica handheld kind of object that has information on board, is able to use technologies to interact via voice to skull with any entities that it comes in contact with, technology that we are working on here on Earth that already exists, and has reached the point where it's now time to make contact. I decided that I would only take this seriously and talk publicly about it if I could validate the main events that it described. So these were the destruction of the megastructure, this rain of debris that had to leave some trace, I felt, some kind of remnants of it, at least potentially. The second element was this bombardment, a multi-directional bombardment. Well, that's got to, leave some geological scar. And the third was the intervention in our evolution that's described, that they decide to modify the indigenous hominins, make them more like themselves, and transfer this culture across to them, kind of raise us up. I thought that also should leave some evidence in the genome. So I took these three elements, and over the years, I dived down into the evidence out there to see whether or not this could potentially be true. Now, my decision ahead of this was that if I couldn't validate at least one of these claims, that I would not want to put my name to it and would not want to talk publicly about it, because there are plenty of stories of people having contact with beings and channelings and landings in people's gardens, all these kind of anecdotal claims. It didn't seem that I needed to boost another one of these. There's plenty of them. But of course, if we could show that information had been transferred about genuine prehistoric events that couldn't be known to the people receiving that information, but that could be validated by other parties later on. Well, that's the gold standard of showing that something is a real contact, is that the supplying of information that's privy to a higher intelligence, not to us, but that we can validate. Ergo, there must be a real communicator involved that is not human. What I found was that, in fact, all three of these described events had real-world correlations with scientific evidence. Now, this was, I'll be honest, unexpected. I thought that maybe one of them or none of them would turn up. It turned out that around about 790,000 years ago-ish, that there was indeed a mysterious rain of silica debris that fell along a 12,000 kilometer long path from China all the way down to Antarctica. Now, this is a mysterious phenomena called the Australasian tektite strewn field, which has been 130 years of research, still considered an open mystery. The second element, of course, was this bombardment. Now, I didn't know that such a thing had happened. I'd never heard of there being such a thing. But it turned out during the course of my investigation that actually in 2016, a team of geologists uncovered evidence of a multi-directional bombardment event with objects slamming into North America, Central America, parts of East Asia and Oceania, and potentially also Antarctica. This was just mind-bending. So you had, objects that were coming from all sides hitting the planet at the same time. And again, the dating here is at around about 790,000 years ago. Okay, so I had two of the major events now seem to be supported by real-world evidence. The third was, of course, the genetic intervention, which in many ways is the most controversial and would have the most impact on us as a species if it were proven to be true. Now, proving this to be true takes a lot, but what I found is that there is evidence that supports genetic modifications to our ancestors. Specifically, there are about 5 lines of evidence. The most important are changes that are observed in the non-coding DNA in areas that are considered to be highly or ultra conserved. So that means that they are very, very stable. Segments of code that haven't changed for hundreds of millions of years across different mammals. I'll give you one example. HAR1, the first of these strange regions that have been changed. This is a 118 DNA letter long segment that, if you compare it across chickens, chimpanzees, and humans, as was done, you find that there is just 2 letters different between the chicken and the chimpanzee. And they have been evolving separately for around 300 million years. So that means that the stability is quite incredible. 1 successful mutation per 150 million years of evolution. Yet when they compared the same segment between humans and chimps, which have had 7 million years, instead of finding no changes, which was expected, they found 18 letters had changed. Now, these are now called human accelerated regions because of the accelerated rate of evolutionary change that's observed in these segments. There are hundreds of these. It's not just these HARs. We've also found in the last few years that there are significant chunks of code missing from these conserved regions, that these are anomalous deletions. Now, these are called H-condyles, or human conserved deletions, where highly conserved DNA has been mysteriously deleted. And instead of having a negative effect, as would be expected, and this is the expectation of the scientists involved, they found that these segments that were removed allow connectivity between other segments that play an important role in giving us our unique brain. This makes us the most different from the other primates. And in fact, over half of the HARs, also the ones that are known as to what they do, over half of these play a role in fetal brain development. So you're starting to get a bit of a flavor here. This is not random. These are changes that play critical, crucial roles in the differentiation of humans from other primates, particularly in giving us our unique, complicated brain. The third sort of modification or anomaly is what's called a three-dimensional folding of the genome, which again was just found in the last couple of years. And this is where the structure of the genome has been reconfigured, allowing regions to touch each other that didn't previously. And again, these changes play crucial roles in the developing of our brain. The other thing about this is it's been determined that that change happened in a single generation. So not gradual accrual of mutations over time, but either in one egg, one sperm, one fetus, or single generation, that this happens as a one-off event. So that's not random mutation. That's not gradual accrual of mutations. So you have these 3 sets of profoundly mysterious changes, and that they all lie at the beginning of the split that leads to us. And now this is timed at around about 750 to 800,000 years ago. Now you'll see some variance on the dates, but at the moment, most of the evidence points to the divergence of our lineage from superarchaics like Homo erectus at around that time, so somewhat after 800,000 years ago. This also leads to Neanderthals, Denisovans, and other large-brained humans. So all of the large-brained humans come out of this divergence event at around that time. Well, that's all 3 of the events and all timed in that same period. So we have some kind of enormous object that rains debris down across a vast part of the world. We have a mysterious multi-directional bombardment event, and we have these completely unexpected anomalies in the human genome that are crucial to make us who we are. And again, these align with the date. We know this is when these humans diverge. So with all these in hand, I realized that we at last have tangible, objective evidence that strongly indicates that there has been visitation. And again, this doesn't come out of just me stumbling on this evidence. We have to remember this has been directed by an intelligence, an artifact that's been in the possession of the Aboriginal people for tens or hundreds of thousands of years, and that has given this information of where to look to show that this is a real event, and has allowed me to do this. So from my perspective, this is a real contact event, and we are still in the process of exploring this evidence. Now, I hope you will want to join us on this journey and potentially work with the project, support the project, share the information, as it's hard to think of a more paradigm-changing discovery, and one that may offer us a hope of reconfiguring the human story, the human narrative, in a positive way at a time when this world desperately needs to be taken down another pathway away from the direction it's currently heading. So hopefully you will explore more of the information that I'm sharing and go on this journey together. If this is, open contact with another intelligence, then, well, we are entering a completely new paradigm. Thank you for listening.